Okay, good morning, everyone. And here in Kansas City, it's a spring morning. We hope wherever you are, it's just as sunny and as warm. In my 3 decades of Dharma practice, I have yet to hear a Dharma talk on the topic of free will. This morning I will hear my first Dharma talk on free will. So it's an interesting topic, an interesting question, particularly vis-a-vis Buddhism, the Buddhist teachings. So as always, we begin by asking the question, what would the Buddha say? WWBS, right? What would the Buddha say? What would the Buddha teach? And more than likely, the Buddha would respond as he did each time his disciples would ask him a question about anything philosophical, theological, metaphysical. You know, is there life after death? Is there free will? Is there whatever? And the Buddha, it is said, would typically not answer their questions. He would simply tell a story. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, a man was walking through the woods and he was shot in the back with an arrow, a poisoned arrow. And his friend who was walking with him immediately grabbed the arrow shaft and began to pull it out. And the man said, no, don't do that. Don't pull it out. Because first I want to know what kind of wood the arrow shaft is made from. And what kind of bird the feather on the arrow is made from. What kind of wood the bow was made from. I want to know the clan, the height of the man or the person that shot the arrow, etc., etc. And his disciples would say, well, Master, surely that man will die before he gets all of his questions answered. And the Buddha would say, yes. And so you too will die before you get all of your various questions answered, because the mind can come up with an infinite number of questions. And if I may be so bold as to challenge the Buddha, I would say, but Your Holiness, we live in a time and a place where the notion of free will is the bedrock of our culture. It's the bedrock of our system of government, our justice system, our legal system. Everything we do revolves around the idea that we have the ability to choose, that we are free agents, endowed with the ability to make choices. So, given that, let's turn to our higher power in our culture for the last several centuries. That higher power is known as science. Science today is the mainstream arbiter of what's true. If we say something is scientifically proven, we typically tend to say, it must be true. Or in a court of law, if a scientist or expert shows up and can present empirical evidence, then that is accepted as legitimate, and the jury will decide accordingly. In our culture, if somebody said, I had a dream, or God spoke to me, or I read it in the tarot cards, the court would probably not accept that as legitimate evidence. Because in our culture, that's not considered a valid standard for what's true. So what does science have to say about free will? Well, it's a question that hasn't been explored until relatively recently. And it's come up with some very interesting results. The first experiment was done in the 1980s using what is known as the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging. You probably know what an MRI is. Well, functional MRI means that the body is functioning as the MRI is taking place, as one is reading the MRI. So in this case, the MRI is on the brain, and the brain is functioning through thinking and making choices. So the researchers were interested in just what goes behind making a choice. So they would give the subject a series of questions that could be answered A or B. Yes or no, this or that. What's called binary choices. And then observe the activity of the brain as those choices were being made. The individual hit a button, A or B, with their thumb. The researchers would watch, and they discovered something very intriguing. To make a long story short, they discovered that the decision, A or B, was made in the brain several seconds before the individual was even aware of making the choice. So it would indicate, or at least suggest, that the choice was made prior to the individual's awareness of making the choice. So if that's the case, do we have free will? Or is there something inside of us that's choosing? And if so, does it have free will? Or is it simply based upon conditioning? Well, about 10 years later, there was some more research done, in the 90s, and they discovered that the researchers were able to not only see that something was going on in the brain prior to the conscious awareness of making a decision, but the researchers were able to see which decision was going to be made. And they actually were able to predict each choice that was going to be made up to 7 seconds before it was actually made. Now, these are not psychics. We're not talking about telepathy here. These are hardcore scientists. So, who's in there? Who's making the choice? Or as one of our beloved presidents used to say, who's the decider? Who's pulling the strings? And I think our friend Eric has the answer to that. Eric, would you put the graphic up for folks? So are we pulling our own strings or not? So let's take that back to the Buddha and say, Your Holiness, this is what we're dealing with in our culture. So I imagine he would respond as he did once again, consistently with the scriptures. He would say, what's your experience? What's true is what's true for you. What's true is what you experience. So if he were to say to me, Robert, what have you experienced regarding this question of free will? I would respond by saying, I don't know if I have free will or not, but one of the things that I'm aware of is that when I'm more aware, I have more choices. With awareness comes choice. No awareness, no choice. No free will. With greater awareness, I have greater free will. I have more choices to make. And I thought, well, if I look at the animal kingdom and see if there's a correlation between free will and awareness, I would say it appears so with the animals. I mean, if you take a clam and a crocodile, I would say the crocodile has more free will and more awareness. But if you take the crocodile versus let's say a bear or a dog or a cat, it would appear that the bear would have more free will than the crocodile. And then if we look at the chimpanzee, some of the great apes, it would appear that the chimpanzees have more choice, more awareness than the bear or the dog or the cat, and so on. And then within the human species, we have various levels of awareness. And so we can all have the same experience objectively, and yet whether or not we have free will to respond to that experience consciously from choice would depend upon our degree of awareness. For example, let's take the topic of anger. Let's just say someone has the experience of anger. And let's say this individual has a relatively low sense of awareness, low self-awareness. And so he, she, I'll just say he arbitrarily, he acts out his anger without even being aware that he's angry. And he has no awareness of the impact that his anger has on himself or on other people. Well, this is real problematic. And of course, there's a huge number of people that are in this particular place in awareness. So let's say this individual grows in awareness, and then he discovers that his acting out of his anger is harmful to other people. It's causing problems, pain for them, and problems for himself. So he sees, for the first time, the relationship between his anger and the impact it has on other people or on other things. So let's say he amps up his awareness even more, becomes aware of anger as it arises. And so he has the ability to see the space between the anger and his action. And so he can make the choice not to act out that anger. So let's say he just suppresses that anger so that it isn't acted out to whatever he does. No, I'm not going to do that anymore. But he recognizes eventually that suppressing the anger is not helpful either to himself or to others, harmful to his body and his relationships. So he begins to see that he can allow himself to feel anger fully and still not act it out. He can feel that anger in his body, not repress it, feel it fully. But not act it out in word or deed. And let's say he amps up his awareness even further, comes to TBC, learns to meditate, listens to Victor's Dharma Talks, and realizes that he can feel the unpleasant sensations in the body that arise when anger gets triggered, and simply be with those unpleasant sensations. And then he discovers that even anger doesn't need to arise. Just feeling, being aware of the sensations in the body, feeling them fully. And let's say we'll go into one more level. He awakens even more and realizes that the unpleasant sensations in the body cause suffering, the experience of suffering. These unpleasant sensations are impermanent. He sees that they are empty of self, that they're not a thing. Anger is not a thing. It's simply a phenomenon of nature, as is everything else he experiences. So in that seeing, he becomes free, becomes awake. His life is changed. He has complete choice, total awareness. And so this external experience, this objective experience, that at one time would cause him or trigger him to be angry and to act out the anger and hurt others and hurt himself without even knowing it, that same objective experience turns out to be the very thing that enlightens him, awakens him, simply because of the different degree of awareness. So, do we have free will? Well, it depends. Awareness brings choice. Do we have free will? It depends. Depends upon one's level of awakening. So as we practice the Dharma, as we practice our spiritual practices in various ways, we may not be seeing any immediate result, but I invite you to observe your life over the months and the years of your practice. And I would guess you will begin to see that as you become more aware, you have more choices. And with more choice, you have the opportunity to become free. And And as you become free, you begin to realize who you really are, your true nature, which is freedom itself. And so I close by dedicating this Dharma Talk to the benefit of all beings everywhere. May all beings be awakened.